Good morning, everyone. I see everyone is coming in from the waiting room. Let's give a few more minutes just for folks to log in and get geared up, and we will start our session in just a few minutes. It's great to see everyone here this morning.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I suspect we're going to have folks coming in on a rolling basis. So rather than postpone for too much longer, let's go ahead and get things started. So I'll just begin by simply saying good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you. I'm Tracy Hester at the University of Houston, and would like to welcome you to our ongoing Inner Center speaker series. I'd like to pass the baton to Dr. Aubin Frederick Nzaou-Kongo, who will give us a bit of a sense of the speaker series and the Inner Center. And then I'll introduce our speaker and we will jump into things. So Aubin, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session alongside our guest speaker, Professor Michael Livermore from the University of Virginia. I'm Aubin, and I'm delighted to say a few words about our program, funded by the European Commission through the H2020 and the Mercury programs. And our next speakers in the series will be in February, and we'll feature Professor Jonathan Gilligan from Vanderbilt University and Professor Simi Payne from Rutgers University. Please feel free to visit our website, www.law.uh.edu/inner-center, where you'll find the upcoming events in the series, but also a great lineup of our past sessions and speakers. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Tracy Hester, co-director of the Inner Center and our chair this morning.
Thank you, Aubin, and it's a pleasure to be here as always. I wanted to just briefly add a little bit about the Inner Center, which is the platform that is sponsoring our lecture series. Many of you I know are return visitors, so you know a bit about the center, but just to remind you, the Energy, Environment, Natural Resources Center at the University of Houston, Law Center, is a research center dedicated to examining the legal issues arising at the intersection of energy and environmental law. We work closely with other multidisciplinary centers at the University of Houston, but we are taking advantage of the unique position we're in at being able to enjoy an excellent university seated in the heart of the energy industry in the United States and the world. This lecture series reflects some of those legal issues, including in some ways our topic for specifically today. With that, let me then turn to our speaker and get out of the way. This is one of those wonderful opportunities where I get to introduce someone that everybody already knows. So this is a relatively easy lift for me. Welcome to Professor Michael Livermore. He is the director for the Communities and Environment and a professor of law at this point at the University of Virginia. He is the well-known figure nationally. I could read his resume for about the next 15 minutes, but I will resist the urge. But I will just note a few things. If you say his name to our colleagues in the environmental legal academia world, he is immediately and closely thought of in relation to the importance and the concerns related to cost-benefit analysis, particularly how its application to environmental law. And he has written extensively and deeply on the topic. He also, I think is one of the more important contributions he's made, he was the founding executive director for the Institute of Policy Integrity at New York University School of Law, which has done outstanding work, including some published under his name. He is a graduate of NYU Law. He was managing editor of its Law Review and is clerk of the DC Circuit, so he comes trailing clouds of academic glory. And with that, I will turn the microphone over to Michael to talk about his latest work.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Tracy and Aubin. It's wonderful to be here. It's a really fascinating lecture series that you all put together here. So it's an honor to be a participant. Let me go ahead and share my couple of little slides just so that you don't have to only look at my face. Okay, so maximize that. You can all see that okay? Yep, great. So today I will be talking about my recently published book with Ricky Revesz, who is teaches at NYU Law and is the current director of the Institute for Policy Integrity. The book is Reviving Rationality, Saving Cost-Benefit Analysis for the Sake of the Environment and Our Health. So I will just kind of talk a little bit about the arguments in the book. If folks have questions in the course of the conversation, feel free to break in. You can raise a hand or otherwise indicate that you have a question, and we can have an interesting conversation. So this project, Reviving Rationality, is a companion to an earlier book that Ricky Revesz and I published called Retaking Rationality. And Retaking Rationality was published in 2008. So just to give a little background on the current project or the most recent project, I think it's useful to have that context of retaking rationality as well. So in Retaking Rationality, what we're basically doing is we're looking at the history of the use of cost-benefit analysis in setting federal regulatory policy in the United States, starting roughly in the 1970s. And the book was published in 2008, so we kind of went through the end of the George W. Bush administration. And the basic dynamic that we describe in Retaking Rationality is that cost-benefit analysis had been implemented really in the first serious way in federal rulemaking during the Reagan administration as part of that administration's kind of broad and explicit anti-regulatory agenda, right? Then candidate Reagan was famous for saying government is the problem, it's not the solution to the problem, right? And so the idea was amongst leaders in the Republican Party and folks in the Reagan administration is that cost-benefit analysis could be used as a tool to essentially tame the regulatory state, that the regulatory state had gotten out of control, starting with the New Deal and then extending to the expansion of the regulatory state over environmental and public health, occupational safety and the like in the 60s and 70s, and that cost-benefit analysis was a tool to dial back a federal government that had become too intrusive. And the idea was roughly, amongst folks at the time, is that agencies were overly myopic. They were focusing on, zeroing in on particular risks, but not thinking about the costs of addressing those risks, not thinking about the broad social costs associated with regulation. And so by disciplining agencies with a tool like cost-benefit analysis, it would naturally lead to less regulation. Okay, so that was the view at the time. And what this led to, naturally, is that groups that were more oriented towards protection, the groups that favored these types of protections, so environmental organizations, consumer organizations, labor unions, and the like, saw cost-benefit analysis as hostile to the interests that they wanted to promote, right? Hostile to their political agenda. And so they fought cost-benefit analysis, and the institution that was most closely associated with cost-benefit analysis, which is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, located in the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. And OIRA, again, under President Reagan, one of his first acts actually in 1981, after taking office, was to invest OIRA with the responsibility for reviewing all major regulatory proposals adopted by administrative agencies across the government. So when EPA wants to propose a new rulemaking, the idea was, and the practice is, to send that rulemaking, a proposal to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. OIRA takes a look at it, and the standard that OIRA is going to be using is a cost-benefit standard. And the EPA, when it's preparing its rulemaking, is charged with also preparing a cost-benefit analysis, and broadly the outline of the process that Reagan implemented. So right at the very beginning, there was this antipathy between broadly progressive, protection-oriented groups, and cost-benefit analysis, and OIRA. And that also mapped onto a kind of executive legislative dynamic at the time as well, because of course, Reagan, when he was in the White House, mostly was dealing with a Democratic legislature, and the House was Democratic the whole time. And so there was, in addition to this kind of interest group mapping, you also had a partisan mapping onto the different institutions, White House and Republican control, seeking to exert more influence over agencies, Congress under Democratic control, seeking to insulate agencies at least somewhat from presidential influence. And so that dynamic exists kind of through the 1980s into the George H.W. Bush administration. And we kind of detail how this dynamic occurred and what the kind of fault lines were and so on. But there was a very interesting and important inflection point in 1992 and the subsequent years when Bill Clinton was elected president. So there was within the Democratic coalition, unsurprisingly, a substantial amount of pressure on the Clinton administration to essentially get rid of OIRA or seriously curtail OIRA's responsibilities, and to really get rid of cost-benefit analysis as the standard used to evaluate regulation, as the methodology used to assess regulation. But that's not what Bill Clinton did. Instead, Bill Clinton maintained OIRA. He wrote his own executive order that made important changes to the process of OIRA review, but maintained the fundamental architecture and the fundamental orientation of OIRA towards, OIRA's responsibilities, reviewing these regulations. There's still going to be White House review, and OIRA is going to use cost-benefit analysis in that process. And agencies are required to, submit cost-benefit analysis and engage in cost-benefit analysis. So Clinton maintains this centralized cost-benefit analysis-oriented process in his administration, and part of what drove us to write Retaking Rationality was, this recognition. What we thought at the time was, a kind of established fact, is that after Clinton makes this move and then governs using cost-benefit analysis for 8 years, and then George W. Bush comes into office and he just maintains the Clinton executive order, he doesn't even adopt his own, that this had become an established part of the administrative state. This was just how we do business in the United States. There's going to be OIRA review, there's going to be cost-benefit analysis. And progressive groups had made a strategic error, and we're making a strategic error by failing to engage on the methodology of cost-benefit analysis. And so what we say is, look, cost-benefit analysis actually can be a neutral tool for policy evaluation. It doesn't have to have an anti-regulatory bent. It doesn't have to have a pro-regulatory bent. It can have these biases or these bents. And what interested actors should do, including progressives, is engage in the discourse about how to conduct cost-benefit analysis. So we say progressives should try to mend, not end, cost-benefit analysis. And so we make this argument in Retaking Rationality. Like I said, it was published towards the end of the George W. Bush administration. And so that's what happened. So that's Retaking Rationality. And we also, right afterwards, we started up the Institute for Policy Integrity to kind of create an organization that helped to demonstrate the principles that we discuss in the book, which is, this idea that cost-benefit analysis can be a neutral tool. It often tilts in favor, it often favors environmental regulation because environmental regulation addresses a market failure. There's lots of reasons why we need environmental regulation. They produce a lot of benefits for society. And so when done correctly, cost-benefit analysis will also show why regulation is justified. So what we do in Reviving Rationality, the most recent book, is we kind of take the story, 12 years forward, right? It was published in 2020, and we describe the experience under the Obama administration and under the Trump administration. We didn't know what would happen with the election when we wrote the book, but we knew that there had been essentially a full term under the Trump administration. So we make several arguments in Reviving Rationality that kind of updates on what we learned from that 12-year experience. So one of the major themes that we provide in the that kind of runs through the book is this notion that, this notion of guardrails in the administrative state, and that as the administrative has grown over the years, including, in the early stages, in the New Deal, during the expansion in the 70s, in the 80s under Reagan and the kind of Reagan Republican Party, that the administrative state has continued to grow through this entire period. But what we've also seen the development of are guardrails that constrain how administrative agencies make decisions, okay? And part of what we argue there is that these guardrails reflect a balance between kind of two competing priorities of the modern administrative state. On the one hand, we want to have kind of expertise, we want to have evidence, we want to have analysis form an important component of regulatory decision making. So it's kind of the technocratic side is a set of values, a set of technocratic values. Legality, right? That we want the administrative agencies to do to be lawful. On the other hand, there's also the idea that we want administrative agencies to be responsive to the electorate. We want them to be accountable to politicians and to political discourse and political institutions. So in some ways, there's this tension between a kind of technocratic and a democratic urges within the modern administrative state. And so these guardrails evolve as a way of managing and mitigating this tension. And what the guardrails do, what that metaphor, the idea is that there's a road, and on the road, that's where political influence is kind of intended to play, right? Is to decide where within the guardrails we're going to land, but that the guardrails ultimately channel that, that kind of political, democratic impulses, and make sure that they, don't go off the rails, so to speak. And so there are many of these different guardrails. We have the Administrative Procedure Act. We have arbitrary and capricious review by courts, muscular arbitrary and capricious review. We have statutes like the National Environmental Policy Act, which affect agency decision making. But what we're focused on is cost-benefit analysis and OIRA. And what we basically argue is that, especially in the post-Clinton world, or the post-Clinton election world, what we've seen is the development of a fairly robust set of norms around how cost-benefit analysis and regulatory review is going to be conducted. It's not just political review. It's not just, hey, whatever the president wants, that's what we're going to do. That there are ways of doing this analysis that have kind of stood the test of time. There's almost like a common law of cost-benefit analysis, and that this common law, right, these conventions of cost-benefit analysis impose important constraints on agency decision-making. And some folks might think those constraints are bad and we would want agencies to be unconstrained, but we argue that the constraints are largely good. They channel agencies in productive directions. They make sure agencies are being responsive to evidence and expertise, and that these are actually very useful inputs in administrative decision-making. Okay, so that's one kind of argument that we make in the book. Broadly, it's about the value of these guardrails and specifically cost-benefit analysis for administrative decision-making. As the kind of historical part of the book we discuss is the experience with cost-benefit analysis under President Obama and then under President Trump. So the Obama part, chapter called the threatening synthesis. So in that chapter, what we do is we describe like I said, the experience under President Obama, and what the synthesis that we're talking about is the synthesis between a fairly muscular regulatory agenda and fairly protection-oriented regulatory agenda under President Obama, using administrative agencies to achieve a progressive set of policy objectives, that was merged with also a very hearty embrace of cost-benefit analysis. Of course, President Obama's first OIRA administrator was Cass Sunstein, who was, a famous proponent of cost-benefit analysis. And so what's interesting is that within the Obama administration, these two, what had been very competitive strands in American political discourse, kind of cost-benefit analysis and the progressive coalition, worked together to generate a very successful presidency in terms of its regulatory accomplishments. Major clean air rules, major rules reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, rules that were ultimately upheld and stood the test of time, even in the face of the Trump administration trying to unwind the rules. And so it was a very successful administration, and achieves those successes not by choosing cost-benefit analysis or a regulatory agenda, but finding ways to make them work together. So what happens during the Obama presidency is that his political opponents changed tack somewhat. So the kind of standard model had been that the Republican Party was really closely associated with cost-benefit analysis. There was this Reaganite tradition. But during the Obama presidency, you see many political figures, interest groups, political figures in the Republican Party start to move away from cost-benefit analysis, embrace kind of alternative ways of attacking the actions of the Obama administration, because these were rules like, say, clean air rules that reduce particulate matter or interstate air pollution, or mercury pollution, or variety of different rules that were adopted were supported by very well-conducted cost-benefit analyses. So you couldn't argue that they weren't cost-benefit justified or that they were economically inefficient. So what the groups and the actors and the political opponents started to do is adopt these kind of rhetorical postures. They would say that the Obama administration is engaged in a war on coal, right? Or they focused on jobs, job-killing regulation. They used the phrase job-killing regulation. Went from didn't exist to it was like a constant, it was a constant refrain that you heard during the time, is that the administration is engaged in job-killing regulation. Another one was you started to hear just the introduction of this deep state rhetoric, right? This idea that you have these bureaucrats who are trying to control the economy and all that kind of stuff. And so this rhetoric starts to be developed during the Obama presidency as a way of attacking, attacking the legitimacy of these rules, which were in fact quite well justified by cost-benefit analysis. So that's the experience under Obama. So what we then move to is the experience under Trump. We obviously have the 2016 election, and part of the point of the book is to note that what went on under the Trump administration wasn't just a Trump thing. That really what he was doing is offering a kind of cruder, more explicit, less sophisticated version of some of the things that were already happening, were very strong trends in the Republican Party that built up in opposition to President Obama. So what actually goes on during the Trump administration is what we call a kind of the charade, is that through kind of explicit and explicit means, the Trump administration is essentially trying to figure out ways to obscure or erase the benefits of environmental and public health protection while making sure that the costs are counted or overcounted. And so we have several chapters in the book that kind of just focus on the ways that the Trump administration does this. And our point here is that, this is really grounded in this notion that there are norms and conventions of how cost-benefit analysis have been done, that these norms and conventions have been adopted and embraced by presidents and administrations of both political parties, that there have been, relatively consistent ways of doing business going back to 1980 under President Reagan. And what happened with the Trump administration is that they broke from these norms and conventions, right? Is that they it represented a radical change in even thinking about the practice of regulatory decision-making and cost-benefit analysis. It wasn't, we would argue, even really doing cost-benefit analysis. It was a charade in that respect. And, it was kind of very far outside the bounds. So there was kind of a range of legitimate disagreement about how to, count costs and benefits and prioritize different areas or whatever. And what happened under the Trump administration, they just moved well far outside of those bounds. So what are some examples? So one is the 2-for-1 executive order. So this is a relatively early move by the Trump administration. And the idea was that for any regulation that was adopted by administrative agencies, they had to go find 2 regulations and get rid of those. And, we wrote a short piece with a co-author, Carolyn Seacott, where, we just go through and say, can this be justified under any theory of decision-making? Like, how can this possibly make sense? Is there a way to make sense of this? And, the answer is no. It certainly doesn't make sense from a cost-benefit perspective, because there's no requirement that the 2 rules that are eliminated have net costs. There's nothing in the order. It just says, get rid of 2 rules. It would be 2 great rules, but, you still are supposed to get rid of them. That makes no sense. What counts as a rule is, it invites kind of gamemanship, like break 2 rules up, or what's 1 rule? Of course, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because the Trump administration isn't trying to do a lot of rulemaking anyway. So it's a very strange executive order. It doesn't make a lot of sense. There was also in the order essentially what amounted to a regulatory budget. Regulatory budget's an old idea that isn't great in principle. It could be okay, but it's kind of highly unworkable and not a really good alternative cost benefit analysis. But even beyond the regulatory budget, the problem was that the regulatory budget was zero. Basically, what the Trump administration was saying is, even if you find a new rule that is highly cost benefit justified, you can't impose any new costs on industry unless you go out and reduce costs somewhere else on industry. And again, this is it's very contrary to the idea of cost benefit analysis, which is that we should go and try to maximize net benefits. It places a really major constraint on the ability of agencies to do that. So that's one example that we highlight in the book. Another example is what are called co-benefits or indirect benefits. So, what are these? And I'll unpack this a little bit because it's a nice illustration of the problems that we saw in the Trump administration. So it's often the case that when an administrative agency makes decisions, there are indirect effects from those decisions. Okay, so like a classic example would be banning asbestos. So if EPA bans asbestos, the primary goal of banning asbestos would be to reduce, asbestos exposure, people, getting lung cancer, asbestosis from inhaling asbestos particles, right? That's the target that you're trying to achieve. But there is a potentially secondary effects, right? Because asbestos is a useful product. It's used to stop fires. It was used in brake pad insulation. And so as people substitute out from asbestos to other products, those other products might not be as good as asbestos, and they might cause problems. So just imagine that, the brake pad replacement that we get from asbestos is not as effective, and it leads to more car accidents, just as a hypothetical. Okay, so on the main line, we're trying to reduce exposure to asbestos, and we might save some lives that way. We might reduce that risk, but we should ask, well, we want to make sure that is going to be, we're going to save more lives and reduce more risk than we're creating over here through the brake pad problem. Okay, so these are called countervailing risks. And in a book by Jonathan Weiner and John Graham, who was George W. Bush's OIR administrator, they highlight the problem of countervailing risks. And basically, courts adopt this logic. They say, look, if you want to have a rulemaking that's not arbitrary and capricious, you have to look at, take a comprehensive assessment. You can't reduce your risk over here and increase the risk over there and ignore that risk altogether, the new risk that you're creating. So the idea of indirect benefits is just the exact symmetrical notion of a countervailing risk. So the idea with an indirect benefit is you have a target thing that you're trying to address. Okay, so you're going to reduce particulate matter pollution. And in the course of regulating particulate matter, you're going to regulate coal-fired power plants, and that's going to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide. Okay, so you're going to get a CO2 benefit and a climate benefit out of your regulation that reduces particulate matter pollution. Okay, so that's an indirect benefit. Again, just same exact idea. You have a target thing that you're trying to address, which is the the main pollutant, but then you have these secondary side benefits. So administrations of both political parties, again, going back to Reagan, acknowledged that validity of indirect benefits, both indirect costs and indirect benefits. So John Graham, the OIR administrator under George W. Bush, in the memo, the A4 circular, which is what it's called, but in the memo that describes cost benefit methodologies for agencies, explicitly says agencies should account for indirect costs and indirect benefits. Agency practice was to account for indirect costs and indirect benefits, again, in administrations, both political parties. What we see under the Trump administration is a willingness, or just, I don't know, willingness is the right word. It just, they in major rulemakings, set aside indirect benefits when it was convenient for them to do so. But in other rulemakings, they actually look at indirect benefits when it was convenient for them to do so, when it justified deregulation. So when indirect benefits justified regulation, they ignored them. When indirect benefits justified deregulation, they took them into account. So here's the examples. So one of the major kind of monumental achievements of the Obama administration was a rule to reduce mercury pollution from the electricity generating sector. Okay, so the target of that rule was air toxics, including mercury. And there are major benefits from reducing this mercury, but EPA at the time decided that it was difficult to quantify and monetize those direct benefits. And so they focused, and so they described them in a narrative way, but they also focused their quantification efforts on a set of indirect benefits. The indirect benefits in that case were reductions for particulate matter pollution. Particulate matter pollution is well known to have very severe human health impacts, including mortality. So the mercury air toxics rule was going to reduce premature mortality by quite a substantial amount. Tens of thousands of people would have their lives extended. And so EPA focused its quantification and monetization and its cost benefit analysis on those indirect benefits. So that was the Obama administration rulemaking. Under the Trump administration, EPA engaged in an effort to undermine the Obama era rulemaking, undermine its legal foundations. And to do so, it kind of redid the Obama era cost benefit analysis, ignoring the indirect benefits. So they basically just said, look, these aren't direct benefits of the rulemaking, and the direct benefits of the rulemaking are like $10 million, and it's going to cost like over $1 billion to do the rule. And so, it was unreasonable for EPA under the Obama administration to adopt this rule, even though, when you look at the indirect benefits, the rule is massively cost benefit justified. So that was the effort of the Trump administration to undo the mercury standard of the Obama administration. Fortunately, that was actually was not successful. So like many things in the Trump administration, it failed. So that's the good news, but that was the attempt. The attempt was essentially to make an argument that the agency shouldn't be looking at indirect benefits in this context. On the other hand, when indirect benefits were favored deregulation, they were all in favor of them. So the example here is the effort to, again, roll back the Obama administration's rules to improve the fuel economy for automobiles. Okay, fuel economy for automobiles, and also reduce greenhouse gases from the transportation sector. It's kind of same deal, right? So you increase fuel economy, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the claims, false, by the way, but just to put that aside, one of the claims of EPA at the time was that rolling back these standards, rolling back the fuel economy rules and rolling back the greenhouse gas standards would free manufacturers to make bigger, safer cars. And as a consequence of having these bigger, safer cars, there would be fewer deaths on the highways. Okay, and they said this is a major benefit of our updated rule, our rollback, is that we're going to make the highways safer. Now, that's actually was not accurate, but even taking their argument on its face, it's an indirect benefit of the rule, right? It's the rule is about, greenhouse gas emissions. That was what EPA was supposed to be taking into consideration, its effects on climate change. You could talk about the costs or whatever, but the idea that EPA should go out and make the standard less stringent in order to make the road safer, that's a complete indirect benefit. So what's happening here is the Trump administration was utterly inconsistent about even how it applied. So one is it departed from the longstanding tradition of accounting for indirect costs and benefits. And in departing from that longstanding tradition, it did so in an utterly inconsistent way. Okay, and which really just flagrantly shows that the analysis wasn't doing any work. The analysis was just a post hoc rationalization for the decisions that the administration had arrived at on political or ideological grounds, which is not the role that cost benefit analysis is supposed to play. So just provide one more example. Again, this is in the context of greenhouse gas regulations. The Obama administration actually responding to a court ruling that had come down at the end of the Bush administration, developed something called the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is this kind of concept that we can assign a monetary value to the damages that are caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, and we can use that monetary tool to evaluate regulations or policies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Say, okay, this is the benefit because we're going to reduce emissions. That's going to be less harm. And so we can value that. And then we can compare the value of the rule against the cost, whatever costs there are. So, so the Obama administration engaged in a very substantial effort, multidisciplinary, many different agencies relying on the best peer-reviewed, work out there to develop an estimate of these greenhouse gas emission damages, the social cost of carbon. It was actually fairly conservative in a lot of ways, in a lot of their assumptions. And so that was done under the Obama administration and used in a number of rulemakings to evaluate, the costs and benefits of different policies. What happened under the Trump administration is they said, stop using this tool. It was kind of a directive to agencies to stop using the social cost of carbon that had been developed by the Obama administration. And ultimately, one of the big moves was to move away from a comprehensive global social cost of carbon and only focus on direct effects occurring from climate change in the United States. Okay, so to ignore like the lion's share, frankly, of harm from climate change and just focus on domestic effects. And there's all kinds of reasons why this doesn't make any sense. One, these are real effects that are happening in the world, and so you ought to take them into consideration, and certainly in your analysis. You could, of course, make a policy judgment about how to weigh these things, but just to acknowledge them as real costs or real harms from greenhouse gas emissions is just kind of consistent with administrative rationality. And then there's also, lots of reasons to think, when we're talking about a global pollutant and we're working with other countries and other actors to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that what we collectively all want to do is look at the global effects of our actions. We want Europe to look at the effects of their actions on the United States. We want China to look at the effects of their actions on the United States. And in any kind of reciprocal relationship, that means that when they should be able to expect us to look at our consequences, the consequences of our actions for them. Okay, so in any case, that was one of the moves of the Trump administration, was try to almost pretend as though greenhouse gas emissions were a domestic pollutant that had only domestic effects, and that really trivialized the nature of this big global problem that we face. Okay, so that was the Trump administration. Basically argued that this was a really failed experiment. The Trump administration had a horrendous record before federal courts, because federal courts, even with Republican judges, saw through the kind of transparently crappy way that they frankly were doing their regulatory decision making. They moved quickly. They didn't conduct their analysis carefully. They violated procedural requirements, and so the loss rate of the Trump administration was just staggering compared to earlier administrations, and it really showed. Again, this is, in a way, you could argue this is the guardrails working, right? Because even though the internal guardrails in the executive seem to have eroded very seriously under the Trump administration, courts still impose some rationality requirements on the agencies. So, all right, I'll just end with the kind of few minutes about where we go from here. So, where do we go from here? So we released the book we wrote the book before we know what the outcome of the election was going to be. We submitted to the publisher in the summer of 2020. Obviously we had an election and a change of administrations. And, what we called for at the end of the book was essentially kind of two big moves. One is to, whoever is in the White House, to rebuild respect for cost benefit analysis, for the institutions of cost benefit analysis, and for the norms and conventions of how cost benefit analysis is done. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we don't ever change and improve cost benefit methodologies, but we should recognize that we're building on an established tradition here. And where we make changes, they should be justified, right? The problem with the Trump administration is, in departing from these conventions and norms, they weren't justified, and they were done in an ad hoc, inconsistent way, purely as a rationalization for decision making, as a way of kind of sidelining experts in analysis. But of course, cost benefit analysis should and can grow and improve and be more comprehensive and more accurate. But the first step of that is what we saw at the time, is to just at least reestablish that this is a valid methodology that can be used in a sensible way, that can be done in an honest way with integrity. And so that's kind of one important move that we felt needed to happen. And then second, we kind of describe various ways that the methodology of cost benefit analysis could be expanded or improved. And so I'll just mention two that are important. So one is in addressing what are difficult to quantify metrics in environmental, public health, safety, consumer policy. So there are some effects that we're actually fairly good at monetizing, right? So we have for years used something called the value of statistical life, which is based on empirical studies of people's behaviors and how they trade mortality risks off against money or convenience or whatever else. And so in theory, you would think that that would be a difficult to monetize value, but actually effects on mortality are fairly easy to monetize because we have an established methodology for that. Like I said, the social cost of carbon is another one. Are these metrics perfect? No, not necessarily, but we have some way of saying, okay, well, we can tell, we have an estimate for what the harm associated with greenhouse gas emissions is that we can use for practical purposes. There are other areas of policymaking that are more difficult, where we don't have good metrics for evaluating the value of policies. A lot of water quality regulations fall into this category. There's a category of kind of existence value that agencies have for years had difficulty in developing methodologies that are broadly accepted. So, this is the value that we all place on there being undisturbed wild places, right? Say in Alaska, say a place that you don't intend to go to, but you care about it, or to protect an endangered species. You're not going to go see a humpback whale necessarily, but you want there to be humpback whales in the world, and you're willing to accept the cost that that's going to come with some kind of cost. But it's hard to monetize that stuff. Obviously, these are goods that are not traded on markets, and there are techniques for monetizing them, but they haven't kind of taken on the place in decision making that you see of like the value of statistical life for the social cost of carbon. So that's one important kind of future development is in improving the monetization of these kind of hard to quantify regulatory effects, or thinking about how to account for them in a non-monetary fashion if that has to be done. A second area for improvement is addressing distributional concerns. So a long-standing critique of cost-benefit analysis is that it focuses on efficiency. It focuses on aggregate costs and benefits. Are the costs more than the benefits, rather than the distribution of those costs and benefits? And so if there's two broad, there's many reasons to care about this, but two kind of common ones that come up are, one, if you're generating benefits for wealthy people and you're imposing costs on less wealthy people, it's not clear that you're making society better off. You're maybe contributing to inequality. The benefits to the wealthy people in terms of their well-being might actually be less than the cost that than the well-being costs that are being imposed on less well-off people, because, obviously when people have more, each unit that they get that's more, it has less of an effect on their well-being. So, if what we're doing amounts to a transfer of wealth from less well-off people to more well-off people, that's not very normatively attractive, and that might not even be, from an aggregate perspective, a good thing. So that's kind of one set of distributional concerns. And then another set of distributional concerns is just kind of reflects the reality that we live in a society where some groups have been kind of consistently targeted or consistently disfavored by the political system or regulatory decision-making. And so if you have the same group of people that are, costs are being imposed on them, or their communities are experiencing excess risks, or they're not benefiting from environmental protections, or enforcement is lax, or kind of whatever other issues come up, that's obviously raises justice concerns. And so there's kind of a host of, how do we think about these justice concerns in the context of cost-benefit analysis, or how do we integrate these justice concerns into regulatory decision-making more broadly? So that's another, kind of area to think about with respect to cost-benefit analysis. The Biden administration, I'll just end with noting, almost immediately upon assuming office, President Biden issued a memorandum kind of explaining, saying, recommitting the administration to cost-benefit analysis, or committing the administration to cost-benefit analysis, reaffirming a longstanding bipartisan commitment to cost-benefit analysis, and then detailing, some of these areas for improvement in cost-benefit analysis. Now, we haven't seen too much come out of that yet. Obviously, we just passed a year marker for this administration, so they're kind of just getting started, and they've had lots of other things on their plate. So some sympathy for them, but but overall, that was the message that has kind of come out of the Biden administration, is that we do want to see these improvements. And there's been lots of intellectual effort outside the administration amongst environmental economists and other people in the policy space to think about how to improve cost-benefit analysis, especially with respect to these equity and justice issues. All right, so I'll wrap that up, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Excellent, thank you. That was a marvelous presentation, and I will remind everybody here to please jump in, either just electronically raise your hand to ask a question, or just raise it yourself, or put it in the chat box, and Aubin and I will be glad to try and curate and collect questions. I'll take the moderator's prerogative, though. I'd like to pick up the ball where you ended and sort of dig a little deeper as to how cost-benefit analysis can find a way to properly incorporate distributional consequences without unnecessarily politicizing the cost-benefit assessment process. It seems people are still trying to figure out the vocabulary and the methodology, but I haven't seen any leading candidates to sort of get their hands around that yet.
Yeah, I mean, so administrations going back to like Clinton have said that they think distribution is important. So in the Clinton executive order, it says that agencies should consider kind of distributional effects. And the Obama administration, even further emphasized distributional considerations. But the reality is none of them have. And part of the reason is that it's hard. For some of the reasons that you kind of allude to, is that there's, it's highly value laden, right? It's a highly value laden enterprise. And part of what makes cost benefit analysis attractive is it has this kind of like technocratic, depolitical, kind of veneer to it. Now, I would say that actually cost benefit analysis is itself embeds some values about how we should think about regulatory decision making. So I think we should just get more comfortable with talking about values and figuring out, how we as a society kind of, we're not going to agree, but are there things that we can agree on? I think we've, sadly, I don't know if we ever had the capacity to talk about values in this way, but it does seem like people have become, that the values conflicts in our society have become seemingly more intractable. I'm not actually sure that that's true, but, but if you look on Twitter, it looks that way. So how do you actually do this? So there's a couple of different things kind of happening simultaneously. So on the one hand, there actually is a long-standing practice that's called equity weighting. That's actually used in some other jurisdictions, where the way it works is you essentially just, for costs or benefits that occur, what you do is you weight them based on people's incomes. So if you impose a $100 cost on someone who makes $30,000 a year, that counts for more than if you impose a $100 cost on someone who makes $300,000 a year. And the theory behind that is just that, $100 count, it has much more of an effect on someone's well-being when they make $30,000 a year than when they make, 10 times as much money. And so that's a method that you could use, equity weighting. And there are prominent scholars and others who argue that we ought to do that. And there are other jurisdictions, including the UK, that use equity weighting in some contexts. There's a classic argument for why we shouldn't use equity weighting in cost-benefit analysis that a couple of professors up at Harvard, Chevelle and Kaplow, are famous for articulating. And the idea there is that rather than using equity weighting, what we should do is we should do the efficient regulation, maximize net benefits. So that means imposing $1,000 of costs on people that make $30,000 a year to generate $1,500 worth of benefits for people who make $300,000 a year. If you use equity weighting, that's not going to make sense, because you're just getting this, because you're actually harming the people worse than you're benefiting the people on the high end, right? So you're not going to do the regulation. And what the Chevelle-Kaplow argument roughly goes is, well, what we should do is do the regulation. You create $500 worth of value, And then what we'll do is we'll tax the wealthy people, in order to redistribute that value so that everybody's better off. Okay, so because the wealthy people are willing to pay $1,500 for the regulation. So say you charge them $1,200, they're still better off by $300. You take the $1,200 and you give it to the less well-off people, the $30,000 people. They pay the $1,000 of cost, but they get compensated at $1,200, so they're up $200, right? So that's the idea. So then the question is like, why don't we do that? Or how should we account for the interplay between efficiency and redistribution? The relative competencies of the president versus Congress, and decisions we've made as a society to allow for very high levels of inequality and not to engage in lots of redistribution through the tax transfer system. There's a lot of complicated questions in there. I think, the first step in this process, though, is to just start to do the analysis in terms of like, okay, where do the costs and benefits fall? So even if we don't have a way of ultimately cashing that out, in terms of like, okay, this is like some macro, decision-making process, like equity weighting. What we can at least say is, okay, here are some people who are harmed. Here are the people who are benefited. If the people who are harmed are really not well off, one thing you might just say is there anything we can do maybe internally to the rulemaking to ease some of those costs, or externally, like other programs that we might, that they might be supplemental to help take the edge off of some of the costs, right? So say you're going to engage in some regulation that has some negative employment effects, which we could talk about. It's actually not that common, but it gets talked about a lot in the press. And so, all right, you have some negative employment effects. Can we counteract that in some way? Not necessarily in the regulation, because maybe the regulation is very well justified, but are there job retraining programs? Are there other sources of investment that could go into these communities? And that's a way of addressing some of these distributional concerns. So it doesn't necessarily mean we have to change the actual regulations, but we can think of how the regulations act within the broader context of other government programs, other economic decisions, and try to adjust the rest of the world in a way to help deal with some of these distributional concerns.
It does seem to invite creativity. For example, is there a cost that could be tallied for the maldistribution of benefits that you then need to account for in the overall cost benefit of the regulation? But that comes into a hall of mirrors, I would think, pretty quickly. So I'll stop there, because I think we could have a very long and fun conversation, but I'll say it for a cup of coffee when we're actually in the same city at some point in the future.
That's good.
I'll open it up, though. Anyone else have any other questions? Because I guarantee you I can hog all Professor Livermore's time easily before we run out. I'm taking the long pause to mean that you're happy with me hogging his time. All right, well, let me ask something that's perhaps a bit more of a riff on the news on the front pages these days, but what implications it might have for cost benefit assessment, which is, do you see any interplay between the revitalization of the major questions doctrine and non-delegation doctrine and cost benefit assessment, since it seems cost benefit assessment plays into the threshold of whether or not a major question's been triggered? Yeah,
it's a really interesting question. So, ever since the dawn of the major questions doctrine, it has just struck me as the most absurd.
I do like the air quotes.
I mean, it's just that, and I really don't think this should be of course it's a partisan thing, because you have the judiciary, and the Supreme Court is, obviously very out of alignment with the other political institutions in terms of its politics. And so it's such an obvious thing, such an obvious effort to move power into the judiciary, that has where there's a clearly different ideological orientation than the other institutions. I think it's very sad for courts, frankly. Courts should operate in more obscure ways when they grab power. They shouldn't be so explicit. That's kind of how courts are supposed to operate, right? So anyway, and it always struck me as a bizarre administrative law doctrine too. When you look at Chevron, part of the justification for Chevron in Chevron is that, presidents are subject to democratic accountability. It's perfectly legitimate for presidents to, at least some of the time, change regulatory decisions on the basis of those of those, of the electorate. And so and these were, of course, opinions, these were sentiments that were offered including by conservative justices at the time. And so in any case, the part of the justification for deferring to administrative agencies is they're accountable to the president's accountable to people. And that justification operates so much more clearly on a major question than it does on a minor question, right? Like people are paying attention to like the vaccine mandate, people were paying attention to that in our society, right? Greenhouse gas regulations, to the extent that we're going to call that a major question, if the court comes around to that view, people are paying attention to these issues. So those are the issues on which presidential accountability is clearest and agency accountability to the president is clearest, because the president's paying attention to those issues as well, right? The president is like signing off on this stuff. Whereas when you take minor regulatory questions, right, that aren't matters of general public debate and discourse, then we might worry about agency capture. Maybe the president's not paying a lot of attention. Certainly the public's not paying a lot of attention. And so the argument for deferring, the democratic argument for deferring to agencies is weaker. So I've always found this like the major question doctrine to be strongly at odds with like any sensible understanding of how judges should interact with agencies. But in any case, it seems to be au courant. So it's the court's going to go this way. What does this have to do with cost-benefit analysis? If the court were inclined to act like a normal court, I think they would say when agencies do strong cost-benefit analyses and then, bring to bear their expertise on, regulatory decision-making, engage in thorough analysis of costs and benefits, do these comprehensive assessments, that should provide courts with a reason to defer to administrative agencies. That's certainly been the practice in the past. Courts are not well positioned to second guess agency judgments about what good policy is, but they are better positioned in evaluating, how good is the analysis? Does the agency kind of conform to standards, the standard way of doing these analysis? So I think that would be kind of traditional and normal, and that's what courts have done in the past. But in this case, what the major question doctrine does is circumvent this entire idea and basically says, well, look, if it's really important, who gets to make the decision. And it doesn't matter how much analysis the agency's done because we're going to look at this essentially de novo. So yeah, no, I think it's a very troubling development, like a lot of people. And, it's just one of those funny things where because of the politics of the day, I think the court is embracing this. And 20 years from now, it could be liberals who love the major question doctrine and conservatives who hate it.
Fair enough. Well, sadly, our time is about up. I had so much more I was hoping we could talk about, including some of the moral challenges to future discount rates, but we'll have to save that for another conversation. What I'd like to do is first thank you again for a marvelous presentation. I want to thank all of you online for joining us and also invite you as well to join us for our next speaker. And Aubin, it's usual in the tradition, I will pass the microphone to you to let folks know who's coming up.
Yes, next month, February, we'll have two speakers. One, Professor Jonathan Gilligan from Vanderbilt University, and then Professor Simi Payne from Rutgers University.
Both outstanding academics and colleagues. I invite everyone to join us. It should be a fun conversation. In the meantime, thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing everyone again soon.
Hey,
take care.
Thanks very much.
You.